5 years. That's 1,825 days I spent looking at the back of Linda's head, memorizing the way her mahogany hair caught the morning sun while she stared coldly at spreadsheets. Linda, my boss. A woman with a silhouette that could stop a heart and a gaze that could freeze a soul. She lived by one rule. Professionalism is the only currency. No dating. No personal lives. No weakness. Today, I reached my limit. I walked into her office and placed my resignation on her mahogany desk. My hands didn't shake. I'm leaving, Linda. I'm 32, and I've spent my best years building your empire. I want a wife. I want a home. She didn't look up, her fair skin pale against her black blazer. But as I turned to leave, a piece of paper slipped from my folder. A private, handwritten list of the traits I wanted in a partner. Intelligent, guarded but kind, a sharp wit, a woman who knows her worth. She picked it up. Her eyes scanned the list, and for the first time in half a decade, I saw her breath hitch. Every single word on that paper described her perfectly. Michael, she whispered, her voice uncharacteristically soft. You're quitting to find this? I nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs. She stood up, her curvy hourglass frame casting a long shadow over the desk. She walked toward me, stopping so close I could smell her vanilla perfume. Then, she leaned into my ear and breathed words that felt like a fever dream. You don't have to go looking very far. I could be that. Wait, did the ice queen just crack? Or is this a trap? I had rehearsed my resignation speech for 3 weeks. I had practiced it in the mirror, in the car, in the elevator on the way up to the 40th floor. I had accounted for every possible response, a cold dismissal, a professional handshake, perhaps even silence. But I had never, not in 5 years, accounted for that. I walked out of her office in a daze, her whisper still warm against my ear, and sat at my empty desk for 40 minutes without moving. The office hummed around me. Keyboards clicked. Phones rang. And I just sat there, staring at nothing, replaying 3 words on a loop. I could be that. It forced me to do something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. Look back. I started working for Linda Reyes when I was 27. Fresh off a failed startup, slightly humbled, and desperate for stability. She had just been promoted to senior director at the firm, and she was already a legend in quiet ways. People didn't gossip about her. They whispered about her. There was a difference. Gossip was careless. What people said about Linda was careful, almost reverent, like they were afraid she might hear them from 3 floors away. She doesn't smile before noon. My colleague Dara had warned me on my first day. Sliding a coffee mug toward me like it was a survival tool. And she doesn't date. There's apparently an actual clause in the company handbook she pushed for herself. I laughed at that. I shouldn't have. It was completely true. She was already seated in the conference room when I walked in for orientation. Fair skin. Dark hair pinned back severely. Posture so perfect it looked architectural. She looked up from her laptop long enough to nod at me and then returned to her screen. That was the full extent of my welcome. But here is what no one warned me about. What I had to discover slowly and painfully over 5 years. Linda was brilliant. Not just capable or efficient. Brilliantly, quietly brilliant. She could read a room in 40 seconds. She could identify the weakness in any strategy before the presentation was halfway finished. She had a dry, devastating humor that surfaced exactly once every few weeks, like a rare weather event, and when it did, the entire room lit up because nobody expected it. I started cataloging those moments without meaning, too. There was the time during a quarterly review my second year, when the numbers were catastrophically bad, and the room was thick with nervous silence. Linda had looked at the projector screen, then looked at the CFO and said, completely deadpan, "So we've essentially paid a great deal of money to discover what we already knew." Impressive. 3 people choked on their coffee. Even I smiled, and I was terrified of her. She caught me smiling. She didn't smile back, but she held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary before looking away. I told myself it meant nothing. Then there was my 3rd year. I had been working on a client proposal until 11 at night, convinced I was alone in the building. I heard heels on the marble floor and nearly knocked over my monitor. Linda appeared in the doorway of the conference room, her blazer off, sleeves rolled to her elbows, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of me without a word. "You stayed late," I said, because I was apparently incapable of saying anything intelligent around her after hours. "I often do," she replied, settling into the chair across from me. "Show me what you have." We worked until 1 in the morning. She critiqued everything, gently, precisely, without cruelty. And when I finally got the framing right, she made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite approval, something warmer than either. "There it is," she said quietly, almost to herself. I didn't sleep well that night. By my 4th year, I had stopped pretending. I was in deep trouble emotionally, and I knew it. A woman who was older, untouchable, and completely surrounded by invisible walls she had built so carefully over so many years. So I made a decision. I wrote a list of who I actually wanted, without filtering it through logic or practicality. And every single word I wrote was her. Were those 5 years of quiet moments accidental? Or had she been fighting something she refused to name? I didn't go home that night. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, both hands on the steering wheel, engine off. The fluorescent lights above me hummed that hollow, institutional hum that makes everything feel slightly unreal. I kept turning her words over in my mind, like a coin I couldn't identify. I could be that? Was it an impulse? A moment of vulnerability that she would walk back by morning, buried beneath 3 layers of professionalism, and that impenetrable calm she wore like armor? Or did she mean it, actually, genuinely mean it, in the way that terrified me more than any alternative? I decided I needed to know. I went back upstairs. The office was nearly empty. The cleaning crew moved quietly through the far end of the floor, and the overhead lights had shifted to their dim after-hours setting, casting everything in a softer, more honest light. Linda's office still had its lamp on, a warm amber glow behind the frosted glass panel of her door. I knocked twice. "Come in." She was still at her desk. But the resignation papers were no longer in front of her. The list was, my handwritten list, sitting in the center of her desk like evidence at a trial. She looked up when I entered, and something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, but close to it. She hadn't expected me to return. Good. I hadn't expected to either. "You read it," I said. "Not an accusation. Just a fact." "You left it on my desk," she replied, her voice measured careful. "Was that intentional?" I pulled the chair across from her and sat down. "No, but I'm not sorry it happened." She studied me for a long moment. Linda had a way of looking at people that made you feel like she was reading something written behind your eyes. It used to unnerve me. Tonight, I held her gaze and refused to flinch. "Michael," she folded her hands on the desk. "You've worked for me for 5 years. You know my policies." "I know your rules," I corrected gently. "I've never been entirely convinced they applied to everything you actually felt." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in that office. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A small muscle near her collarbone tensed beneath her white blouse. These were the microscopic tells. I had spent 5 years learning to read. The tiny fractures in the porcelain. "That's a presumptuous statement," she said finally. "Maybe," I admitted. "But you whispered something to me an hour ago that was considerably more presumptuous, and I didn't call you on it then." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Linda didn't surrender smiles easily. But the corners of her mouth moved in a way that suggested one was being actively suppressed. "Fair point," she said quietly. She looked down at the list. Her fingers, elegant, unringed, rested near the edge of the paper, without touching it. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped half a register, and that careful professional armor had developed a visible crack. "Were you really leaving?" she asked. "To find someone like this?" "I was leaving," I said, "because I'd already found someone like this. And I had convinced myself she was completely unreachable." The silence returned, but it was different this time. Warmer. Weighted with something neither of us had named yet. She stood slowly and walked to the window. The city glittered below, thousands of lit windows, thousands of lives in motion. Her reflection floated in the glass, and I could see her face without her knowing I was reading it. For one unguarded moment, she looked tired. Not exhausted, tired. The way a person looks when they have been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "I built these rules for a reason, Michael," she said to the window. "They weren't arbitrary." "I know," I said softly. "I never thought they were." She turned then, and the city light fell across her face. Fair skin, dark eyes. Something raw and real moving behind them that she hadn't let me see before. "Then you understand," she said carefully, "why this terrifies me." And there it was. Not a confession of love. Not a promise. But the first honest thing she had ever said to me that had nothing to do with work. My heart didn't hammer this time. It simply settled, quietly, with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. If she was afraid, it meant there was something worth being afraid of losing. And that meant everything. But I still didn't know. Would she let that fear win? Would morning bring the version of Linda that wore the armor, or the one standing in the window light, honest and uncertain and aching human? She called it transition discussions. I appreciated the precision of the fiction. Very Linda. If something needed to exist outside the boundaries of her carefully constructed world, she would simply rename it until it fit. So our meetings became transition discussions. A professional, sanitized label she applied to what were, in reality, the most alive hours of my week. It started 3 days after the resignation night. She texted me at 8:17 in the morning. Not an email, a text, which, for Linda Reyes, was the equivalent of anyone else showing up at your door with flowers. "Coffee?" "The place on Meridian. 10 o'clock. Bring the Henderson file if you want a reason to be there." I smiled at my phone for an embarrassingly long time. I didn't bring the Henderson file. When I arrived, she was already seated. Back straight as always, both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. She was wearing something different from her usual boardroom palette. A deep burgundy sweater that softened her entirely, that followed the curve of her shoulders, and the elegant architecture of her figure in a way her structured blazers deliberately concealed. She looked up when I sat down, and I watched her notice that I'd come empty-handed. "No file," she observed. "No file," I confirmed. "So this is just coffee. It appears so." She looked at me for a moment with that evaluating gaze, and then, quietly, almost privately, she smiled. A real one. Not the controlled, Professional acknowledgement I had collected like rare currency over 5 years. A genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes and stayed there. I felt it somewhere in my chest like a key turning. The weeks that followed were a careful, exquisite unraveling. We met twice, sometimes 3 times a week. Always at neutral locations. Coffee shops, a quiet corner table at the restaurant near the park, once on a bench by the fountain where she fed pieces of her croissant to pigeons with the focused seriousness of someone completing an important task. I watched her do it and said nothing for a full minute. "You're laughing at me," she said without looking up. "I would never," I replied, deeply, obviously lying. "You have a very loud internal laugh, Michael. I've always found it annoying. And yet here you are, voluntarily, feeding birds." She cut her eyes at me sideways, fighting the smile and losing. The croissant was too sweet. "Of course. Don't read into it." "I'm not reading into anything," I said, leaning back on the bench with my arms folded. Utterly reading into everything. She threw a piece of croissant at me. I caught it. She looked both appalled and delighted by this, which was the most Linda Reyes thing I had ever witnessed. But beneath the banter, something deeper was quietly taking shape. One afternoon, over tea she hadn't finished, she told me about her last relationship. She spoke without drama, clinically, almost, but her hands told the truth, wrapped tight around the mug. Knuckles pale, a man she had trusted completely, a colleague. Someone who had used her vulnerability as a professional weapon when things ended. Who had whispered her private fears into the wrong ears and watched her spend 18 months rebuilding what he damaged in a single conversation. "After that," she said quietly, staring into her tea, "I decided the distance wasn't cruelty. It was architecture. I was building something that couldn't be knocked down." I didn't say anything immediately. I let the words settle where they needed to settle. Then I said, "The strongest buildings aren't the ones with the thickest walls, Linda. They're the ones built on foundations that can absorb impact without cracking." She looked up at me then, really looked. The way she had in the window that first night, unguarded and uncertain and present. "That's either very wise," she said softly, "or something you read on a coffee cup." "Absolutely a coffee cup," I admitted. She laughed. Quietly. Genuinely. The sound of it filled the small cafe like light fills a room when someone finally opens the curtains. And I thought, this is exactly what I wrote on that list. Not perfection. Not invulnerability. This, a brilliant, wounded, extraordinary woman learning, one careful moment at a time, that she could be known without being destroyed. But something was coming. I could feel it. The world outside our quiet meetings didn't know the rules had changed. And the world outside never stays quiet for long. If you're feeling this story, drop a comment below. Tell me, has anyone ever made you feel seen without trying? Because that's exactly what Linda was doing to me. And I wasn't ready for what came next. It started with a photograph. Someone had taken it outside the cafe on Meridian. Candid, unposed, the kind of image that captures something truer than either person intended. Linda leaning slightly toward me across the small table, her dark hair loose for once, her expression open in a way the office had never seen. Me, watching her with something written plainly across my face that I hadn't even realized was visible. By Monday morning, it had traveled through the company's informal network with the speed and precision of a carefully aimed arrow. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped off the elevator. The floor had a different texture to it. That particular quality of silence that exists not because nothing is happening, but because everyone has agreed to pretend nothing is happening. Heads dropped to screens a half second, too deliberately. Conversations paused at angles that suggested they had been about something before I arrived. Dara caught my eye from across the room and gave me the smallest, most apologetic shake of her head. My stomach dropped. Linda's office was dark. Blinds drawn, something she never did before noon. Her assistant, a precise young man named Collins, was stationed at his desk with the specific stillness of someone who had been given very clear instructions about who was and was not permitted entry. "She's in a meeting," he said, before I'd opened my mouth. "With who?" A pause that lasted one beat too long. "The board." I found out the details from Dara at lunch, spoken quietly over food neither of us touched. Gerald Marsh, a senior board member who had opposed Linda's last two policy initiatives and lost both times, had seen the photograph. He hadn't sent a company-wide email. He was far too intelligent for that. Instead, he had requested a private review meeting with 3 other board members under the banner of leadership conduct and professional standards. A scalpel, not a hammer. Designed to make Linda herself question whether she had compromised her position. "He's not trying to fire her," Dara said carefully. "He's trying to make her small. Make her feel like she did something shameful." I set down my fork. 5 years. 5 years of watching Linda carry that company's strategic vision on her shoulders with a steadiness that never wavered publicly. 5 years of watching her absorb criticism, redirect blame from her team onto herself, and rebuild after every institutional setback with the patience of someone who understood that excellence was a long game. And one photograph, one unguarded, human moment, was being used to dismantle it. The anger that moved through me was quiet and cold. The worst kind. She called me that evening. Her voice was composed, terrifyingly composed, in the way that told me she was holding something at significant internal cost. "I need to step back," she said. "From the meetings. From..." A pause, carefully measured. "From this. Appa, Linda, Michael. Please don't make this harder than it already is." Her voice dipped slightly on the last word. Just slightly. But I heard it. "They're using one photograph to question 5 years of your integrity," I said. "That's not a professional concern. That's a personal attack, dressed in policy language. I know what it is." Her voice was tight now, controlled. "That doesn't change what I have to do." "Which is what, exactly? Prove them right by letting them shrink you?" Silence. "I built everything I have on my own terms," she said finally. "I cannot," her voice caught, just once. A small fracture in the composed surface. "I cannot let one choice undo that, even if that choice was the first real one I've made in years." The line went quiet between us. I could hear her breathing, slow, deliberate. The way a person breathes when they are working very hard not to feel something. "Will you sacrifice us?" I asked quietly. "To remain someone they feel comfortable with?" She didn't answer. The call ended, and I stood in my apartment in the dark, holding a phone that had gone silent, wondering if the woman who had just called herself afraid had finally let the fear win. Don't go anywhere, because what happened next? What she did, I did not see coming, and neither will you. 3 days of silence. Not the comfortable kind we had built together over cafe tables and park benches. This was the other kind. The kind that has weight and temperature, that sits in your chest like swallowed stone. I sent one message on the second day, nothing dramatic. Just, "I'm here, whenever you're ready." She didn't reply. I told myself I was respecting her space. In truth, I was terrified. Not of losing the possibility of us, though that fear was present and persistent, but of something quieter and more devastating. I was terrified that Linda Reyes, the most capable woman I had ever known, was sitting alone somewhere convincing herself that smallness was safety. On the morning of the third day, I got dressed, drove to the office, and requested a meeting with Gerald Marsh. His assistant looked at me with mild surprise. I was, after all, technically no longer an employee. My resignation was still being processed. A bureaucratic delay I had privately considered a gift. I still had a building pass. I still had a reason to be there. Marsh agreed to see me. I suspected curiosity was the reason. He was exactly what I expected. Silver-haired, measured, the kind of man who delivered devastating things in a pleasant tone, and considered it sophistication. He gestured to the chair across from his desk with the magnanimous patience of someone who had already won. "Michael," he said warmly, "I understand you're transitioning out. What can I do for you?" "You can leave her alone," I said. The warmth didn't leave his face, but something behind his eyes shifted. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "I think you are," I said. "And I think you know that what you're doing has nothing to do with professional standards and everything to do with the fact that Linda has outmaneuvered you twice in 18 months, and you haven't forgotten it." A long pause. He studied me with the careful attention of someone recalculating. "You're a young man making a significant assumption," he said. "I'm a young man who spent 5 years watching that woman protect this company with more integrity than anyone in this building," I replied. "And I'm telling you clearly, whatever you think that photograph represents, you're wrong. And if you move forward with this review, I'll make sure every piece of work she's produced, every decision she's made, every outcome she's delivered is documented and visible to people considerably above your authority." It wasn't a perfect speech. My voice wasn't entirely steady. But it was honest, and sometimes honesty has a weight that polish can't replicate. Marsh said nothing. I stood, nodded once, and left. I don't know what shifted exactly. Whether it was that conversation, or something Linda decided independently in those 3 days of silence. I may never know the full architecture of it. What I know is what happened at 4:17 that same afternoon. I was in the lobby, waiting for the elevator down, when I heard heels on marble. I turned. Linda was walking across the lobby floor with the full, unhurried authority of someone who owned every inch of the space they occupied. Blazer on, posture perfect, but her hair was down, deliberately, consciously down, and her expression carried something new. Not coldness, not the careful neutral mask, something open and decided and quietly fierce. She walked directly to me, stopped close, looked up with those dark eyes that I had spent 5 years learning to read. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't," I said. "I do." She held my gaze steadily. "I almost let them make me ashamed of the best thing that's happened to me in years. I won't do that again." The lobby was not empty. 3 colleagues visible. Collins at his desk. A security guard near the door. She didn't lower her voice. "I don't want transition discussions, Michael," she said clearly. "I want the real thing. If you'll still have me." My throat tightened in a way that made speaking temporarily difficult. "Linda," I finally managed. "I wrote that list when I was 29 years old, and somehow described a woman I hadn't even admitted I was already in love with." Her breath caught. Just once. Then she did something I had waited 5 years to see directed entirely at me. She smiled, fully, without reservation, without armor. And the lobby, the board, Gerald Marsh, the photograph, the rules, the walls, all of it became briefly, beautifully irrelevant. And if you've ever had to choose between being safe and being real, between the life that protects you and the one that actually fills you, then you already know exactly how she felt in that moment. Stay with me, because 1 year later, everything looked different. And I want to show you what different looks like. 1 year. It is a small unit of time when measured against everything that came before it. 5 years of careful distance. A lifetime of constructed walls. Decades of deciding that vulnerability was a synonym for weakness. But 1 year, I have learned, is enough. Enough to change the temperature of a life. Enough to make a person unrecognizable to their former, lonelier self in the best possible way. We didn't rush anything. That felt important to say, because the story of how we began could suggest a kind of romantic urgency. Whispered confessions, lobby declarations, a list that named her before I had the courage to. But Linda was not a woman built for urgency, and I had learned to love her rhythm. So we moved at the pace of something real, slowly, intentionally, with the particular tenderness of two people who understood that what they were building was worth building carefully. She never returned to the no-dating policy. She didn't abolish it publicly or make a statement. She simply stopped enforcing it. The way you stop locking a door once you've decided the thing you were afraid of is no longer something to fear. The board noticed. Nobody said anything directly. Gerald Marsh requested a transfer to the London office 4 months later, and Linda signed the paperwork with a serenity that I found privately magnificent. The apartment we shared now was hers first. A clean-lined, carefully ordered space that had, over 12 months, developed what I could only describe as warmth. Not clutter. Linda would never permit clutter, but warmth. A second coffee mug that lived beside hers on the shelf. A pair of my reading glasses on the side table. A kitchen that smelled of actual cooking on Sunday mornings, instead of the takeout containers that had apparently been her primary sustenance for years. You're domesticating me. She informed me one Sunday, watching me make eggs with the suspicious expression of someone observing an unexplained phenomenon. I'm making breakfast, I replied. You're humming. People hum. You're humming and making eggs, and you've moved my spice rack. Your spice rack was alphabetical, Linda. Nobody needs alphabetical spices. She was quiet for a moment. Then, alphabetical is a perfectly rational organizational system. It had allspice next to anise. When have you ever needed those in the same moment? She sat down at the kitchen island, folded her hands with great dignity and said, I want it noted that I am tolerating this. Noted, I said. Also, these eggs are going to be the best thing you've eaten this week. And you know it. She said nothing. But when I set the plate in front of her, she picked up the fork immediately, which was the most Linda Reyes form of agreement in existence. One evening in early autumn, we were sitting on the small balcony. Her with tea, me with coffee, the city doing its amber evening thing below us. She had been quieter than usual, something turning slowly behind her eyes. I had learned not to rush those silences. They always arrived somewhere. She set her mug down and reached into the pocket of her robe and produced a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases, handled many times over. My list. I stared at it. You kept it, I said. I kept it, she confirmed simply. Linda, I read it that night, she said quietly. Her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone delivering something they have rehearsed and then decided to say differently. After you left my office. I read it, and I sat there for a very long time, because every word. She stopped. smoothed the paper once with her fingertip. Every word felt like being seen, and I had forgotten what that felt like. My throat tightened in that familiar way. I was terrified, she continued. Not of you, of how much I wanted it to be true. She looked up then, her dark eyes clear and steady and completely open. So I kept it. As proof that someone had looked at all of me, the difficult parts, the cold parts, the guarded, complicated parts, and still written something that looked like love. The city murmured below us. Somewhere distant, something chimed. I reached across and covered her hand with mine. It was always love, I said, even when I was convincing myself it wasn't. She turned her hand beneath mine and held it, firmly, the way she did everything, with quiet, complete conviction. We sat there as the city lights multiplied below. Two people who had chosen the harder, realer, infinitely more worthwhile thing, and found, on the other side of all that fear and distance and carefully constructed walls, something neither of us had a sophisticated word for. We just called it home. And that list, that worn, folded, impossible piece of paper, sits on our bookshelf now, not hidden, not framed. Just there, the way the truest things in a life tend to be. Ordinary, irreplaceable, quietly everything. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, or something you're still hoping for, leave a comment below. Tell me what you're holding on to. Subscribe if you want more stories that feel like this. Because the best ones are always the ones nobody expected to happen. And they happen every single day.